How's it going, guys? Welcome back to Localism, the podcast that asks if we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your host and guy whose entire mental health turns on how annoying I'm allowed to be about my fantasy football team on Sunday, Blunchley. Today's episode, part 2 of our book chat about Bookchin and Biehl's Libertarian Municipalism. One quick housekeeping thing at the top. My voice might sound a little bit funny during this episode. I'm getting over an illness. I'm still feeling fine enough to record, but if I sound a little bit different, that's why. Let's start with a brief little recap about what we discussed last time. After spending way too long on Biehl and Bookchin's individual biographies and their shared history, we then proceeded to, again, spend way too long on Libertarian Municipalism's connection to the Middle East and the Syrian Civil War. But after that, we got into the content of Biehl and Bookchin's book proper, and hey, what a coincidence. It turns out there was a lot in there that sounded a whole lot like localism. Seems like Biehl and Bookchin and Libertarian Municipalism, which I sometimes refer to as LM for short, are all about creating local direct democracies where people can engage in self-rule. These new communities, which Bookchin refers to as municipalities, regardless of whether they are rural or densely urban, would be autonomous and would not be subject to control or preemption by governments elsewhere in the American hierarchy, in other words, the state or federal government. Empowered, autonomous, directed democratic local governments engaging in self-rule? That's just absolute localism, baby. It's not reformist localism, which, as discussed in previous episodes, would involve giving local governments a kind of local-level 10th Amendment right that meant all powers not delegated to state governments remained with local governments, and also carves out a space of matters of local concern in which local governments can legislate without being preempted by state governments. But at least as far as we've discussed thus far, the solution proposed by Bookchin and Libertarian Municipalism lines up pretty near one-to-one with what I'm already on record as saying is my preferred form of localism, absolute localism, the one where we turn the pyramid of preemption upside down and make local law the defining highest form of law in America, save for the Constitution and the rights that it grants via the Bill of Rights and elsewhere in the Constitution. About this matching thus far between Libertarian Municipalism and localism. I mean, first of all, wow, what a shock. The podcast that promotes localism managed to scrounge up a book that says a lot of the same things that localism is saying. Who could have predicted? But second of all, this buddy-buddy matching might have surprised some of you who listened to me talk at the beginning of the last episode about how much this book pisses me off in a lot of ways, and how I had some pretty serious disagreements with what's in it, and how even though a lot of what was in Biehl and Bookchin's book fascinated me, I also had a lot of serious problems with it. Some of you might also have been thinking, this book is technically called not just Libertarian Municipalism, but specifically The Politics of Social Ecology, Libertarian Municipalism. We sure do seem to have talked about the Libertarian Municipalism half a whole lot. What about that social ecology bit? Fear not. The reason I kept things so happy and hand-holdy, isn't it nice how much localism and LM get along in the first episode, is so that I could have a second episode all about my gripes. So strap in as I get to do one of my favorite things, complain. Okay, let's get this thing rolling. So last time I talked about the thing that Libertarian Municipalism wants to do, self-ruling, autonomous communities organized along directly democratic procedures. But we were a little bit hand-wavy over why Bookchin and Biehl wanted to accomplish this huge change in America's political and governmental structure. Let's get into that now. As we'll see, that why is very, very, very different from localism's why. Fair warning, folks, while this is definitely still a book chat episode, there's also going to be a lot of comparing and contrasting Libertarian Municipalism with localism, so it's sneakily also a please consider thinking about and supporting localism episode. Then again, aren't they all? Beginning with a big picture summary of why Biehl and Bookchin want to reform America into self-ruling direct democracies, before we get into actual selections from the text, remember that Biehl and Bookchin are capital L leftists, and Bookchin specifically is kind of a leftist without a home, one that wandered through communism and Trotskyism and anarchism before rejecting them all for failing to meet his very exacting standards. Strains of that leftist thought directly informed their goals for promoting LM, and those goals are, quite simply, to do three intertwined things. First, to eliminate the capital S state. Bookchin's anarchist leanings are strongly on display here. To him, the capital S state, the modern nation state as we know it, is so profoundly unjust that it needs to be abolished entirely and replaced with local autonomous municipalities united in various vague forms of relation. That means no more China, France, Russia, or especially America. Second, Bookchin and Biehl want to heavily rework economic life in a way that is explicitly decentralized, anti-capitalist, and worker-controlled, and see the devolution of power to local governments as the best way to achieve that leftist economic system. Third, and this is where the ecological strain of Bookchin's thought really comes in, Bookchin doesn't just see destruction of the capitalist state as essential to achieving just governance and just economic life. He also views abolishing nation-states in favor of smaller self-ruling communities as essential to avoiding environmental collapse. The form of local direct democracy Bookchin proposes is something he views as essential to reduce life to a smaller scale that pollutes and consumes less. Of course, all three of these objectives, political, economic, and environmental, are intertwined. For example, a different governing structure drives a different political decision-making process, which makes it more difficult to lobby for certain subsidies or more easy to pass environmental regulations, which in turn alters economic activity, and that activity then has environmental impacts that are either good or bad. I presented them as Bookchin having three distinct objectives, but they really are more like one big interrelated left-wing program. Just to get out ahead of this, Bookchin's program is not the Localism program, and I'll have more to say on why the two don't align in this respect later. For now, I just wanted to flag that even though I'm about to explain the why of Bookchin's desire to create directly democratic, self-ruling local governments, Localism is not signing on to that why. I'm doing solely that, explaining so that I can give you the full picture and full context of Bookchin's theories and recommendations. Again, neither I nor Localism are endorsing any of this stuff, and I'll explain more later. With that out of the way, let's start getting into some actual selections from the text that help illustrate why Bookchin is pushing for the local democracy self-ruling community solution that Localism also seeks, but for different reasons. Note that a lot of our information on this comes from things Bookchin wants to do after achieving the Libertarian Municipalist reforms that create directly democratic municipalities. First, here's a key quote from a chapter about what Biehl and Bookchin call a municipalized economy. Quote, "The movement to create a libertarian municipalist society will face many social adversaries as it grows and spreads over ever wider areas. One of those adversaries, of course, is the nation-state, that coercive power structure that substitutes a system of elites and masses for direct democracy, yet has the insolence to label itself democratic. Another foe is urbanization, that warping of the city that further lays waste to the political realm by replacing the city and the community with the megalopolis. Still another foe is hierarchy, the various institutionalized divisions of humanity according to gender, ethnicity, race, age, and status, in which one group is endowed with the right to dominate others, often by invoking a mythic biological superiority as justification. But perhaps the most pernicious and intractable enemy that the movement for fundamental change will face is of another order altogether. That enemy is capitalism itself, and the social devastation that it has wrought on human societies across the world." So yeah, that gives you a real good flavor of the mindset that Biehl and Bookchin are bringing when they recommend directly democratic local governments as a solution to America's economic or other ills. Also interesting to note the opposition to urbanization, not to engage in a whole other axis of controversial politics, but partly because of their anti-market stance and partly because of their environmentalism, Biehl and Bookchin infuse a real left, not in my backyard NIMBY vibe through a lot of their work. Anyway, like I said, outside our wheelhouse at this point, but wanted to note it as something interesting. So Biehl and Bookchin are trying to kill capitalism with municipal libertarianism. What exactly are they proposing should replace it? They're not a fan of cooperatives, which they define as, quote, a collectively owned and operated enterprise of some sort. It may be a producer's cooperative or some other worker-controlled enterprise, such as the collectivized and self-managed enterprises advocated by anarcho-syndicalists, or it may be a purchaser's cooperative, such as a food co-op, as advocated by many environmentalists. They don't like cooperatives because they view them as just too bound up in the private market, meaning that, quote, cooperative enterprises have in the end been obliged to conform to marketplace dictates, regardless of the intentions of their advocates and founders. No, what Biehl instead proposes is a kind of municipalization of the economy, in which all businesses and other generators of public activity are owned by the local government and administered via direct democracy. Sorry, no private market allowed. Quote, "This municipalization of the economy means the ownership and management of the economy by the citizens of the community. Property, including both land and factories, would no longer be privately owned, but would be put under the overall control of citizens in their assemblies. The citizens would become the collective owners of their community's economic resources and would formulate and approve economic policy for the community. It is they, and not bureaucrats or capitalists, who would make decisions about economic life. Citizens would make these decisions regardless of their occupation or their workplace. Indeed, they would ultimately make decisions for the entire economic life of their community. Those who worked in a factory would participate in forming policies not only for that factory, but for all other factories, and for farms as well. They would participate in this decision-making not as workers, farmers, technicians, engineers, or professionals, but as citizens. The decisions they make would be guided by the needs of their community as a whole, not by those of a specific enterprise or occupation or trade. They would serve the best interests of the community. End quote. Yeah, obviously a lot to unpack here, but I'm mentioning all this just to give you an idea of what Bookchin is suggesting, and I'll provide more of a response later once I'm done laying this all out, and we get to the comparing and contrasting with localism part of this episode. In a chapter called A Rational Society, we get these nuggets about what Bookchin calls a moral economy. Quote, this ethos would also have to infuse economic life if the political realm is to survive. A society organized along mutualistic, non-hierarchical, and communal lines would be most rational if it chose to replace the capitalist market economy with a moral economy, one whose members were possessed of a high sense of mutual obligation. It would replace classes and private property with cooperation and solidarity. It would replace profit with a recognition of mutual welfare. It would replace selling with sharing. It would replace rivalry and an illusory independence with reciprocity and interdependence. By replacing a profit-oriented economic nexus with an ethical one, it would transform economics into culture. What would economic production look like in such a society? Honest forms of production that required arduous toil or that were mind-numbingly tedious would be performed not by people, but by machines and factories. The products and technologies essential for a post-scarcity society would be manufactured in industrial plants, durable goods and medical equipment, textiles, means of communication and transportation, machine tools, electronics, and so on. The productive technologies in these factories would be enhanced, far more than they are now, by processes of automation and cybernation. An aside here, I think he's referring to like computer stuff. This was 1998, a very different technological time. That would allow the machines themselves to perform work with a minimum of human labor. Machines would make machines, as they already do to a great extent, and would require human intervention, mainly for design and repair. Specialists would design reasonably unobtrusive factories, whose machines, in the event of a breakdown, would be repaired by maintenance people. But very little, if any, manufacturing production would require toil or tedium, let alone significant labor. It may seem jarring to speak of such industrialism in the same breath as values of complementarity and mutuality. But industrialism is at odds with cooperation only if one considers industrialism to be synonymous with capitalism and the exploitation of labor. The industrial plant in a libertarian municipalist society would be collectively owned by the people and cooperatively managed as part of a moral economy, not a capitalist economy. Perhaps more important, the minimization of human labor would create the material preconditions for a society infused by mutuality and cooperation. Indeed, it is the very productivity of such factories that would make possible the prevalence of the mutualistic ethos of the rational society. End quote. Fascinating stuff. Bookchin the environmentalist, Bookchin the realist who says, hey, we're going to need to do some international trade. You can't make everything at home. Bookchin the guy who dings co-ops for being too entwined with capitalistic forces is also saying, don't worry guys, we will just have a lot of collectively owned automated factories that will do all our work for us. Not a word about how those machines are going to be developed and how libertarian municipalist communities would pay for them or who is going to be in charge of keeping them up. Aside from human repairmen, which is not a lot of detail, etc. Also, not really a lot of discussion about how it's possible to get the materials for these machines or their products without engaging in a global capitalist market, but I digress. And how does this fully automated luxury libertarian municipal economy save the environment? Well, here's the answer we get. Quote, without the capitalist economy, whose grow or die imperative is the primary force behind the ecological crisis, citizens would be free to reconstruct the social world along ecological lines. Cities could be physically as well as institutionally decentralized. Town and country could be integrated into a unified whole, and the historic conflict between them effaced. Fossil fuels would doubtless be eliminated, replaced with clean, renewable sources of energy, even in factory production. The world of non-human nature would no longer be conceived as a realm of scarcity, as capitalism conceives it today, with too few resources that must be fought for tooth and claw, but as a domain of fecundity and evolutionary advance towards diversity and complexity. Sure. Don't worry about how automation and computerization save labor time precisely through increased centralization. Also, don't worry about how alternative energy projects and energy infrastructure in general is some of the most capital intense, difficult development to accomplish, and 100% operates along principles of centralization that may not be amenable to or feasible for community by community reproduction. And sorry, Bookchin, but a lot of the material resources needed to realize alternative energy production, for example, the lithium needed to make efficient batteries to store energy produced by solar or wind power, are very much limited resources within a realm of scarcity rather than a domain of fecundity. What are you going to do when there's a tension between obtaining the resources your libertarian municipalist economy needs to become self-sufficient with respecting the fact that those resources are located in the global south or in other communities that might not be interested in sharing them with you? But again, I digress. I'm sure all of my criticisms are answerable, and in any event, they're besides the point. As we'll see, localism has a very different set of answers to the questions Bookchin raises and engages with. But before we get into how localism diverges from Bookchin on all this stuff, we have one more bit of Bookchin and Biehl's book to talk about. It's the part I like to call the scary part, because it has a bunch of scary shit in it. It's the point where Bookchin and Biehl go from saying, hey, wouldn't it be cool to achieve local direct democracy by careful cultivation of a local movement over years, to, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we started shooting people? That's a bit of hyperbole on my part, I'll admit, but it also isn't a completely inaccurate description of something that Bookchin and Biehl are advocating for. So the scary section is the chapter that is entitled Dual Power. Now, by utilizing this specific term, Bookchin is invoking left-wing politics. Technically, all dual power is a situation where a second political structure has risen up alongside an existing political structure and begins to compete against or challenge it. For example, the idea that Biehl and Bookchin raised about unofficial democratic assemblies that convene to vote on recommended legislation if the city council / powers that be won't let you make democratic assemblies part of the actual city government. You know, the idea that I actually think is a super great way to get the process of democratization started. In theory, that is a mild move towards dual power, creating this alternative political structure that challenges and then maybe ultimately subsumes the small R Republican city council government. But the term dual power really has its roots in possibly the most important leftist occurrence in history, the Russian Revolution. We don't have time to get into the entire story of the Russian Revolution here, but let me give you enough background to give color to the term dual power and explain what exactly it is Bookchin and Biehl are doing when they invoke it. Like many revolutions, the Russian Revolution was really a series of consecutive revolutions that occurred across an extended period. One of those revolutions was the February Revolution, which actually occurred in March 1917 under our Gregorian calendar. Russia was still using the Julian calendar at the time. During the February Revolution, mass demonstrations and violent clashes with regime police resulted in Tsar Nicholas abdicating. When the dust settled, members of the Russian legislature called the Duma formed something called the Russian Provisional Government. But this wasn't the only governing structure in town. Also formed after the February Revolution was something called the Petrograd Soviet, a representative council of Petrograd, which is what the city at that time was called, later was called Leningrad, and now it's called St. Petersburg's, workers and soldiers. Initially just a representative of people in Petrograd, the Soviet eventually began to claim that it was a better and more representative body than the Russian Provisional Government, and thus should be the body in charge of running Russia. This resulted in a situation that came to be known as dual power. The Russian Provisional Government was legally and supposedly the government of Russia, but the alternate Soviet form was talking and acting as if it was the actual government. Whatever the legal documents might say, be damned. This created great tension between the Petrograd Soviet and the Russian Provisional Government, fostered in particular by Lenin and his Bolshevik followers in the Petrograd Soviet, who began to call for all power to the Soviets and to overthrow the Provisional Government. Things came to a head in October, again technically November under our modern calendar, of 1917. Cashing in on the political and ideological legitimacy it had obtained as an alternative dual power, the Petrograd Soviet, led notably by Bookchin's one-time flame Trotsky, voted in favor of a military uprising to overthrow the provisional government. And that's exactly what happened. The October Revolution saw the Petrograd Soviet and Bolshevik-aligned soldiers rise up and take control of Petrograd, thereafter declaring the Bolshevik Soviet system to be Russia's new government. This promptly kicked off 5 years of bloody civil war, but in 1922, the Red Army stood victorious, and Soviet Russia was officially in place. Bit of a diversion, like I said, but you can see how throwing around the word dual power is invoking a pretty damn serious history. By titling this chapter as Dual Power, Biehl and Bookchin are bringing that history to bear to undergird their subsequent discussion. And what's in that discussion? Well, let's see. Quote, over the long term, as the movement for change grows, more and more municipalities will democratize themselves and form confederations. Eventually, at a certain point, when a considerable number of municipalities have been democratized and confederated, their shared power will constitute a threat to the state. The existing power structure will hardly tolerate the existence of a confederation of democratized municipalities that has created a democratic politics and empowered citizenry and a municipalized economy. The state will move against the new democracy in defense of capitalism and its own power. The movement will be at the mercy of the state if it fails to create a civic guard to protect and defend the concrete popular power that it has come to embody. Indeed, if the movement is to be serious about opposing the state, it must work to divest the state of its most important attribute, its monopoly of armed force. Okay, very cool and normal start. Surely this is going somewhere totally fine. Quote, despite the current popularity of militias among far-right groups in the United States, the right holds no exclusive title to the militia tradition. For a century and a half, the international socialist movement recognized the necessity of an armed people or a citizens' militia. Every socialist international since the first one demanded that a militia be substituted for the army and the police. The anarchist and syndicalist movements, too, once considered an armed people to be a sine qua non, I probably fucked up the pronunciation of that, sorry, for a free society. No consistently radical position today can surrender the demand for an armed people without in effect making it possible for the state to continue to exist. Libertarian Municipalism, as part of the socialist and anarchist tradition, thus calls for the ultimate formation of a civic militia, or civic guard, to replace the police and military forces. So we're forming armed militias after we democratize local governments. Like Threeper-style armed militias? We're specifically comparing them to current far-right militias? Geez. And what are Bookchin and Biehl saying we should do with these fun little militias? Absolutely nothing good. Quote, the larger and more numerous the municipal confederations become, the greater will be their latent power, and the greater will be their potential to constitute a counterpower to the nation-state. As they realize this potentiality, tension will grow between themselves and the state. The citizens in the confederations must dearly recognize that this tension is desirable, indeed that their confederated municipalities constitute a potential counterpower to the state. They must recognize that they are essentially reviving the long historical conflict between the municipality and the state, and that their confederation cannot live in harmony with it. In fact, the confederation of municipalities may eventually gain enough power to constitute a dual power, one that could ultimately reclaim complete power for the people. If and when this point is reached, the social and political conditions will likely be unstable. Sooner rather than later, most likely in a confrontation, the issue of who will have the power, the municipal confederations or the state, will have to be resolved. That is, power will have to be shifted toward the people and their communities, or else it will remain with the state and the professional practitioners of statecraft. Ultimately, the confederations will likely attempt militarily to replace the state with their own structures. By this time, it is to be hoped that the Libertarian Municipalist movement will have institutionally hollowed out the state power itself, winning a majority of the people over to its new civic and confederal structures. If the state's authority can be delegitimated in the eyes of most people, then hopefully it can be eliminated with minimal difficulty. Okay, cool. So just to summarize, the hippy-dippy, let's save the environment, let's have fun little education groups and local politics and struggle sessions and decentralized economies, Biehl and Bookchin here, are explicitly calling for a military uprising to overthrow the government. Don't just democratize your local government, take your newly democratized local government, associate it with other similarly democratized local governments, and then use that new associative framework to create a situation of dual power tension that the local governments resolve via armed violence. And am I going crazy? Have we lost the plot a little bit? How did we just go from trying to have more say in what happens in our own communities and a more just form of government to, and this is the part where we try to overthrow America by force and make an army and start shooting people? Sorry to any viewers that might feel different, but I don't love the idea of calling for an armed uprising. I'm not for that. Localism isn't for that. But you know who is? Biehl and Bookchin. Their hope is that we have a 1917-style Russian Civil War situation where, quote, the confederations will likely attempt to militarily replace the state with their own structures. Forget all that peace and democracy shit. Forget whether or not there might actually be other communities or other people that want a structure that's different from libertarian municipalism. It's time for the guns to talk. To be honest, I'm not completely convinced that Biehl and Bookchin themselves appreciate how serious what they're proposing is, without any degree of self-recognition or even any transition. The book goes directly from the scary shit about armed rebellion to arguing about whether or not people who support libertarian municipalism should run for state government or for mayor. Bit of a jarring move. So this is the point where we start trying to lay military siege to Washington, D.C. Anyway, did you know that libertarian municipalists should run for mayor because it would help educate people? Really bizarre stuff. And that's where we'll leave off, in terms of summing up Biehl and Bookchin's book and their ideology. Their thought can really be divided into two pieces. First, the idea that we should change our form of government to give self-rule power to directly democratic and autonomous local governments. Second, that we should use the platform of these new self-ruling directly democratic local governments to achieve a variety of objectives, some of which aren't facially unreasonable: help the environment, try to make things fair for workers, see ways that automation can be handled justly and equitably while making our lives easier, and some of which are just completely off the deep end, like magically having all of our hard work done by automation and not needing to engage in capitalist global markets anymore, and forming militaries to challenge the federal government. Again, I cannot emphasize how insane this is. They are saying, let's do our own version of far-right militias and eventually use those to militarily overthrow the American government. Just insane. This two-piece framework to Biehl and Bookchin's thought is helpful because it shows why libertarian municipalism and localism are simultaneously so similar, but also very, very different. That's because localism's first piece is the same as libertarian municipalism's first piece: change our form of government to give self-rule power to directly democratic and autonomous local governments. But the second step is different, and that's because in localism, there is no second step. And to explain why, we're going to move into the part of this episode that's less about just what Bookchin's book literally says, and more about comparing and contrasting libertarian municipalism to localism. Here's the thing. Bookchin is arriving at the local direct democracy solution specifically as an emanation of his left-wing principles. There's stuff he wants to do, and he sees the LM local authority model as the best setting in which to do that leftist stuff. That's simply not the case with localism. There is no broader political sensibility, left or right, that is motivating localism or wants to use it as a springboard to accomplish other things on a broader national scale. I don't think it would be fair to describe localism as non-political. It's a political movement with political ideals and political goals. But I think it might almost be fair to call it non-partisan, or at least not operating along the normal political divides that have occupied the American political space during its modern history. And the best way to show why that's the case is to return to the localist pitch, to use my own very plain language to explain why I ascribe to localism and view it as a good solution to the problems of American political life. There's two things that make me a supporter of localism. The first is just the simple desire to have more of a say in the laws that are in place in my community. Right now I, and probably you, unless you happen to be rich or famous, in which case I don't know why you're listening to this podcast, you probably have better things to do, have exactly jack shit ability to change laws that we don't like or think are wrong. Yeah, sure, we get to vote for some old dude with his brains melting out of his ears every 2 or 4 or 6 years, big fucking whoop. Those people, Democrat, Republican, whatever, they don't give a shit about us. You know that. I know that. Hell, we've lived it. They can't give a shit about us. Because in order to keep their jobs, they have to kowtow to the moneyed interests that donate big money to elections and the political interests that give them the political party infrastructure to run on. This is true on the federal level, this is true on the state level. And because of the way that preemption works, this means that the levels of government that have the most power to control your life are also the ones that give you the least amount of say and care about you the least. Local government, the government that's closest to you, the one that's most accountable to you, the one where you can actually go out and cause change by working with others in your community, is the one with the least power, thanks to things like preemption and Dillon's rule. That just makes no goddamn sense. The people who live in a place should have the most authority to say what happens there, not a bunch of career politicians in some state or federal capital hundreds or thousands of miles away. And yeah, sure, local government's definitely got its share of problems too. oftentimes is captured by all the same political and economic interests that have captured state and federal politics. That's why implementing the direct democracy component of localism is so important, to make it so it's average people making the important decisions together as a community, rather than professional electeds under the control of external political and economic entities. But even if you don't get to that direct democracy portion, even if all you achieve is just making it so your garden variety local government has more power and can't be overridden by the state or federal government so easily, that's still a huge win. Because I promise you this, however fucked up the local politics in your community might be, I promise you that in the overwhelming majority of cases, you have a 10 billion% higher chance of finding a way to create and bring about change at the local level than you do of exercising any degree of agency at the state or federal level. That's just the sad truth of how America works right now. That's part one of why I support localism. The important decisions, the important laws should be made by the people and communities who have to live with the consequences of those decisions rather than a bunch of distant party politicians. I think that's a pretty intuitive position. I think there's a lot of other people in America, including people who probably disagree with me about a bunch of other stuff, who nevertheless think that communities should be able to decide for themselves how the law should work, and who think that ordinary people should have that decision-making power rather than politicians. But part two of why I support localism is even more intuitive, more basic, and frankly, more emotionally raw. It's why I'm specifically a fan of absolute localism, the one that just turns the pyramid of preemption upside down while preserving the rights in the Constitution, rather than doing all the good but ultimately less impactful reforms that go into the local 10th Amendment and matters of local concern vision of reformist localism. And that reason is just that I don't want to have to share a body of laws with a lot of you anymore. I've been pretty open about the fact that I'm more left-leaning than most of my audience and probably most Americans. There are fundamental issues: vaccines, abortion, the proper relationship between religion and government, taxes on the wealthy, the environment, universal health care, military spending, housing, unions, Israel-Palestine, that I simply have no faith there is any ability to reach compromise on with other people in America. Like, I'm just never going to see eye to eye on that stuff with a 65-year-old hardcore MAGA Republican from Alabama who sits around watching Fox News all day. It's just not going to happen. And you know what? I know that 64-year-old hardcore MAGA Republican from Alabama who sits around watching Fox News all day feels exactly the same way about me. He doesn't want to share a body of laws with a lefty like me who lives hundreds of miles away from him and disagrees with him on pretty much all of the fundamental questions of American life. And under our current system, where neither one of us has the ability to determine the laws in our own backyard, where we have to share the same federal body of laws that hurts us both, our only choice is to try and beat each other down in a zero-sum game where one of us is winning necessarily means that the other one is losing. And that's fucked up. That's not how things should be. If we live hundreds of miles apart in places with vastly different cultures and economies and problems and values and faiths and peoples, then we shouldn't have to worry about what the other is thinking or take account for their opinions when we're deciding how things should be run where we live. We wouldn't have any reason to hate each other, if not for the fact that in order to make things change in my own community, I have to succeed in a federal system that necessarily means that things will have to work the same way in Alabama too. And the reverse is true. If that Alabama Republican wants to see his values expressed in his community, then his only path to succeed is to impose his will on my backyard too. No wonder we live in such a divided country. No wonder this kind of environment fosters hatred and violence between people who ordinarily would never even meet or know each other or even need to think about each other. No wonder we're always at each other's throats. We have to be. When winning requires domination, it's either dominate or be dominated. And that's why I want the localist vision to become a reality. I just want to have a say in the laws that apply where I live, without having to fuck over somebody 5 states away. And I just want that person to be able to do their own thing without it fucking me over. And living in a country where each local government is given primary legislative authority is exactly what that allows. That's why I say that unlike Bookchin and Libertarian Municipalism, there is no part 2 to the localist vision. Bookchin says, great, self-governing, directly democratic local governments are here. Now let's use them as a springboard to impose a leftist vision on the rest of America and even try and get rid of the federal apparatus altogether. Localism says, great, self-governing direct democracies are here. Now I can do what I want in my own backyard and stop having to think about what's going on elsewhere. So long as I can make my own decisions about the things that matter in my community, I don't care what people in Florida or Alaska or California or whatever the fuck are doing. If they want to build their alligator Alcatrazes and pray in schools and stop taking vaccines, whatever, man. That's not my problem. Just like it's no longer their problem, whatever I may choose to do with immigration and religion and healthcare in my own community. We make our own decisions and stop having to care about what's going on elsewhere in America. There is no Libertarian Municipalist style nationwide program of shared social, cultural, and economic revolution. There is no step 2. And before I move off this point, I want to acknowledge something that happened in America the week that I'm recording this. Charlie Kirk got shot. Now, I'm always honest with you guys, and I'm not going to stop now. I didn't like Charlie Kirk. I didn't like his ideology. I didn't like his debate bro shtick. I didn't like him as a person. And I'm not sorry he's dead. What I am sorry about is the way he died, and what his death means for the country, and what the fact of political assassination says about the state of politics for us all right now. I'm sorry for what his death means. And while I can't say that if we were living in a localist society that he'd still be alive, and that we wouldn't have young men who view violence as the most desirable way to achieve their political objectives, here's what I will say. Part of the reason the temperature is so high right now in America, and there's so much division, is precisely because the American form of government is so zero-sum. It is a winner-take-all politics where everyone is forced to share the laws passed by the people at the top and suffer under their particular preferences and prejudices. So long as we remain in that zero-sum system, and so long as people continue to suffer under that system because they perceive themselves as being overridden by external and hostile forces elsewhere in the country who have completely different values from them, and so long as the people in elected office continue to be rich geriatrics who don't give a shit about anyone except themselves and the interests that put them in office, then Americans are going to continue to be drawn towards a nihilistic spiral of tit-for-tat violence and oppression. To escape that spiral, to lower the temperature, we need to make it so what I do politically in my backyard isn't a threat or a counterweight or an imposition or some part of some broader political calculus that is inflicted against you. And whatever you do in your backyard isn't a threat to me. After all, as strange as it may seem, the Kirk assassination and the subsequent fallout have actually shown that there's a point in which we are united, and in fact are more united on this point than we have been maybe ever in the nation's history. And that point of unity is that we kind of just fucking hate each other now. We just hate each other. And we need to start looking for solutions where we're in each other's lives less. Localism is exactly what I think that solution should be. All right, rant's over. Time to get off my soapbox and get back to comparative points between libertarian municipalism and localism. The lack of a broader political program, the view of local directly democratic and self-ruling local governments as a goal in themselves, rather than a goal in furtherance of other independent agendas, is the biggest difference between localism and libertarian municipalism. But there are some other differences that should be noted too. There's a difference of revolution versus reformation. Libertarian municipalism is a revolutionary ideology. It wants to destroy and overthrow the current system of politics. Localism is a reformation-based movement. It wants to operate within the current system to achieve change rather than just blow up the system by force. Everything localism advocates for is legal. Even absolute localism is premised on using constitutional amendments or other legal avenues of reform rather than overthrowing or dissolving America or seceding from it. There's the difference of how libertarian municipalism and localism value America as an entity. Localism wants to seriously change the country, but keep it around as a vehicle for good relations between constituent parts, and to maintain the rights and liberties granted by the Constitution, which is our most important shared political and historical artifact. Libertarian municipalism just wants to get rid of America entirely, just sweep it off the board. There's the issue of universalization. Localism recognizes and respects that not everybody loves local democracy and might prefer other forms of government. It doesn't seek to export any particular form of government that might form in a local government here or a local government there to every single other part of America. In fact, localism doesn't even demand that every single part of America jump onto its idea. It recognizes that there are other communities that might like small r Republican forms of government or might want to continue the current relationship they have with the federal government. It isn't saying it's our way or the highway. It's saying, here's a way that we're going, and you're welcome to join us if you want. Compare that to Libertarian Municipalism, which postulates local direct democracy as the only form of just government and presents it as the only acceptable solution for any community anywhere in America. And maybe most important of all, especially given recent events, localism has absolutely no acceptance of or tolerance for the use of violence to achieve its political objectives. Maybe this makes me not based or whatever, but if given the choice between engaging in a bloody war to achieve a localist America and instead keeping just the status quo, I'd rather just keep the status quo. War and conflict and violence are a terrible thing, and once the Pandora's box is opened, you have no idea what's going to happen next, or if the political objectives you brought to the opening of that box will survive once everything is unleashed. I simply have no interest or desire to tell people to go out and hurt other people or get themselves hurt to achieve a political objective. Call me naive, but I truly think there is a peaceful, legal way to accomplish localism without the need for anyone to get hurt. If you think differently, sorry, localism isn't for you. Sounds like you're more of a Biehl and Bookchin type, who not only find violence acceptable, but even admire it, as a method in line with the leftist traditions they descend from. With that, we've reached the end of today's episode, and of this two-part book chat series on Biehl and Bookchin's Libertarian Municipalism. Next time, we begin the final stretch of our little sojourn into book chats, by taking a look at a right-wing author and his dark vision for what our future might hold, unless we embrace local agency and local difference. At times somehow even more self-righteous than Bookchin, and at times disturbingly plausible, the ideas our next book will present will certainly give us a lot to think about. So please do come back next time when we start our treatment of David French's Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat, and How to Restore Our Nation. If that sounds interesting, please be sure to follow us on Spotify or on our YouTube channel at LocalistPod. That's Localist with a T, pod. If these long-form podcasts aren't your thing, then we also do these great 3-minute long YouTube shorts that give a more condensed version of the podcast episodes. And check us out on Blue Sky at localistpod.bluesky.social. Finally, if you have any questions or comments, send me an email at localistpod, again that's localist with a T, pod, @gmail.com. Catch you guys next time. A huge thank you to Kevin McLeod for letting me use the 2 songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.